I have a very special episode for you today. It's Lori Brady. She's the Senior Director, Human Resources and Workforce Development at Nuclear Energy Institute. Now, what's the Nuclear Energy Institute? The Nuclear Energy Institute aims to promote the use and growth of nuclear energy through efficient operations and effective policy. It serves as a voice of the U.S. nuclear industry, representing its interests before Congress, the executive branch, and federal regulators. NEI also works to shape policies and regulations that promote nuclear energy domestically and globally. So here's Lori Brady, and also as a special treat, Anthony Brown, who's her admin type person that helps her out, and he asks a couple questions and has some insights. So I think you're really going to enjoy this almost hour and a half meeting with Lori Brady. I'm going to ask you hopefully some interesting questions. The first one I think about is someone once said, there's two issues in life, wanting something and then getting it. And if you look at nuclear power and nuclear energy over the years, we've always wanted to be top of mind when it comes to energy and green energy and all that. And we finally have that opportunity. But I always think about, what are we going to do with this opportunity?
Of course, as a proponent of nuclear energy and all the benefits that it brings, whether you're talking about how reliable it is, how clean it is, that it's a baseload source of energy, et cetera. I'm very excited about the future. I'm also very excited about where we're taking in technology developments for the industry. The existing light water reactor fleet is fantastic, and it's got so many great things going for it. But we've got a lot of really great technical advances on the horizon that not just for generating electricity, but other ways to use the heat from those processes to do some other great things. So there's a lot of great things coming up for nuclear, and I'm really excited to see where we take it and where we go. There's hurdles and obstacles, including the workforce challenge issues that I'm sure we'll discuss. But having said that, if we can, as an industry, come together and work through these challenges and obstacles, we've got a really bright future. Very excited about it.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it too. We've heard about several nuclear renaissances, but I don't know if that's a word. But yeah, this one is especially interesting to me because there's so much need now. I think over the years, we've put off building baseload units, even though natural gas is pretty abundant. And now nuclear's in that discussion because it's a non-fossil fuel. But let's talk a little bit about a whole ecosystem around nuclear energy. Talk to me about how you can create that, especially around the workforce development you mentioned.
And what I was talking about related to ecosystems is when you talk about workforce development does not happen in a cylindrical container, as an example. It's not something that is just one party or two parties. To develop a sustainable workforce ecosystem that can help both now and into the future, you have to have a variety of parties on board and involved in those conversations. Because let's say, for example, you're looking at developing a new plant somewhere. To have that plant, you need to have the roads to get people to the plant. You need to have the housing so that people have places to live near the plant. You have to have all of those logistic things, as well as all the information and systems and processes and practices in place that you need to actually hire, recruit, train, etc. So you cannot do workforce in your own little secluded bubble. You have to have your local workforce boards. You have to have your local government groups and agencies. You have to have your academic institutions. You have to have your employers and a wide variety of other different types of groups to build a sustainable plan and model for workforce in any given area. And so one of the things that the Nuclear Energy Institute is working on with the industry is developing what I'm calling hubs, nuclear hubs. And what I mean by that are these are ways that different areas are approaching how they're looking at workforce. Some of them are building consortia. Some of them have statewide mechanisms in place to deal with their workforce issues. Different groups doing things in different ways. But the idea is all the same, which is we need to build these ecosystems in those locations so that we can make this be successful and sustainable over the long term. So it's bringing all those different groups to the table, having all those conversations, understanding the supply, the demand, who does what, where it comes from. For example, if you're looking at the educational institutions, you need to have a sense of the types of jobs you're going to have available if you're going to build this new plant. Some of these positions may come out of trade schools. Some may come from community colleges. Some may come from university programs. You have to make sure that then you're able to, number one, have those educational institutions available to you to educate and then pull that labor. Or you have to get creative and do things like engage in remote programs and things like that. So all of those things are considerations that you have to look at as you're looking at workforce development in any one given area. I hope that's comprehensive enough of an answer. If not, I'm happy to go into it further. But
yeah, I want to follow up with that because it sounds like a huge endeavor. How do you break down the elephant one bite at a time there? So take an example or apply that and give some more specifics on how you apply that into your plan.
Absolutely. First of all, what you try to do is build on existing success. So some things already exist out there. For example, in Virginia, there's VNEC. They were established through a legislative process in, I think, 2013 or 2014. And they have done some great things bringing all those different types of groups together to talk about nuclear energy in Virginia. They have a lot of different programs in place. They're very active, and they had very active participation among the various communities. What we don't want to do is have to create something new every time we're going into an area, right? So we want to share our best practices. We want to share where we've had successes, and we want to share where we haven't had successes. And that's one thing that nuclear energy, I think, does better than virtually any industry I worked with before, is we share the good and the bad with each other. And that's what we want to do. So one of the things that NEI is looking to do later this year is we're going to bring together a bunch of people from all these different consortia and state groups that are developing across the country. And we're going to have those conversations. We're going to talk about how to develop those ecosystems. We're going to talk about where we've had successes already. And we're going to talk about where we haven't done our best work. Share that and set up that best practices sharing so that we are hopefully keeping the best of what's successful and getting rid of the worst of what's not been successful.
Wow. It reminds me, I did a local podcast called Marietta Stories, and I interviewed a principal at a small grammar school, and she brought up the fact that if you wanted a student to be successful, you had to not only see that student while they were at the school, but think about them when they went home. Did they have people at home that could support them? Could they speak the language? And they created a whole mentoring process around not having that. It sounds like that's what you're trying to do with the nuclear industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're getting into some really interesting sub-points of things that we need to think about. Just to touch on a couple related to that, as you look at career awareness in our industry, you can't just target the students in the schools as an example. You have to target parents because they're so influential on what students do and where they take their career trajectories. So there's things like that. But more than that, you have to think about things like if we're going into areas where there's not a history of nuclear, and there's not history even potentially of these types of STEM positions, then people aren't going to know how to even do those tests. So they're not going to be successful. So as we look at all of the different components, that's a type of question and issue we have to look at. How do we ready people to get ready for positions in nuclear? Because they're distinct and they're unique from a lot of different other types of positions. And if you have a community that's not used to dealing with it, they haven't grown up in an infrastructure where they know how to handle these things and understand how to deal with our tests and our ways of recruiting. Part of it is that we as an industry need to adapt accordingly. But the other piece of that is that we need to be cognizant as we go into these communities that we have work we need to do.
Yeah, you had mentioned that you worked in the healthcare industry and there's a lot of need. It's a high risk environment, requires a lot of training up front. And obviously you've had challenges when it comes to finding the right people. How did you tackle that? Are you using similar concepts with this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the thing that I've discovered about both human resources and workforce development over the years. It's the same thing, different dynamics, different jargon, different critical shortages. And so what I mean by that is when you're dealing with human beings and you're dealing with workforce development in general, It's the same teaching and learning concepts. It's the same understanding of career growth paths and opportunities and how to train and learn and setting up the right pathways for people. That's all the same. But when you go from industry to industry, what you're really doing is you're really having to determine what the unique things are about that industry and how they're dealt with in that industry and how they're talked about in that industry. There's very specific qualifications and skills that need to be dealt with, whether you're in healthcare or in nuclear energy. You need to understand those fundamentally so that you can put the right things in place at the right locations or right programs. And some of these things, one of the things that's great about nuclear energy is we're really great about, if there's not existing programs, we're really great about building our own. And sometimes in healthcare, we relied a bit on existing solutions that were out there. And we were a little bit less creative, I think, in terms of coming up with those programs. But in nuclear energy, I would say that we have a really creative approach to dealing with training and education. I think we need to push that even further because as our demographics change, there are new challenges to be addressed in teaching and learning environments. But I'm sure that's a conversation we'll have at some point.
Yeah, I think about like if I'm looking to start a venture capitalist, looking to put in an SMR, I have to have a roadmap of some kind to get from A to B. Like, how do I even start this? Do you provide that?
We're trying to. Now, having said that, one of the great things that we're experiencing right now is through NEI's Workforce Working Group, who does a lot with the industry's workforce, we have members from across the spectrum. One of those members on that group is TerraPower. And of course, they have their permit to build and that kind of thing.
In a place called Kemmerer,
where there's very little infrastructure. And so one of the great things has been is that he's been part of the Workforce Working Group, and we've been able to share back and forth information. And one of the things that I intend doing, because he's such a great part of my team, and I've already told him this, is I intend on putting together a case study of all the different kinds of things that he's encountered and done, because I think that experience can directly apply. More than that, we want to put together a toolkit for groups who are looking to go into places. The new technologies can either be in the middle of a city in terms of a microreactor or out in the middle of Alaska, right? And those are very different dynamics in terms of workforce infrastructure. We want to have a toolkit available that helps people check the box and go through and say, okay, do you need a program here? Do you need this type of curriculum? Do you need this type of thing? Do you need remote access? Do you need help from the local groups on housing and blah, 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 blah? Do you need this and this? And so with the experience that we're getting with TerraPower, that's helping to add into that. But we already have it as a group. One of our projects is to develop that toolkit for our advanced reactor groups. A lot of them just don't even know yet. They have an idea of what their staffing plans might be, but until they get closer and really figure things out, they just don't know at this point. So they're figuring it out themselves.
Yeah, it's funny. It reminds me, I did a lot of project work at McGuire Nuclear Station, and I hired a contract engineer who became one of my supervisors. And he told me, and it really played out this way, he said, 80% of your risk is the people sitting in those chairs, the people you hire. And knowing how to build that workforce was a real skill that I leaned toward. Knowing that I wasn't the smartest guy in the room, it really worked well. But it did take a lot of skill to do that. How do you see that fitting into what you're doing?
Yeah. First, I also want to point out that there was one thing that you said that made me go off on a small tangent, but I think it's an important one. We're living in such interesting times that we have such different dynamics occurring. As an example, one of the things that I thought about when you talked about that is we are now recommissioning decommissioned units. We've never done that before. We're in a whole new arena. So in addition to doing things like building new advanced reactors, we're also in a new era of recommissioning decommissioned plants. And that's a whole different thing that we need to learn from as well. It's really interesting times. I'm sorry, can you go back and ask me the question again about skills building? I know it was something about skills, but I got off on a tangent in my head.
No problem. I was just, speaking of tangents, I'm a tangent guy too, but I was just up in Michigan last week, and I'll mention this before. The question I had was about 80% of the risk was the people we hired. But the thing I wanted to share about Palisades, which I thought was interesting, is people had scattered because they had shut down. And a lot of them came back. And it wasn't because of the money. It wasn't because they had to work. It was because, one, it felt like a community to them. And I
Right.
interviewed their ops director and one of their first level leaders while I was up there. Great stories, but they wanted that feeling. They wanted to get that feeling back that I'm part of something bigger. I want to build this community. I want to bring back good jobs. I think green energy is important for the country. So that was really driving their behaviors. And it really, what was so cool and got me a little emotional at the end of the seminar I was helping with is they said, I didn't know starting the week how many great people we have here, but it gives me makes me feel like we can make our aggressive date to get this plant back online. So just spreading the word about that was so cool.
Yeah, I agree. I've heard very similar stories. I know several people who have been up in Michigan working in various capacities during this. And one thing I will reiterate that you said, because I feel it not just from the stories I've heard, but I also see it every day when I'm in the industry. I would say for somebody who's worked in healthcare and hospitality before, I have rarely met such a passionate group of people as those who are in the nuclear energy industry. They truly care about the future of the planet. They truly care about doing a great job. They truly care about bringing energy to the world. They care about their jobs. They take it very personally, and they just care very much about what they're doing. And I would say that for somebody who's worked in healthcare, where they also tend to care about people doing a good job, I have been so pleasantly surprised by the amount of passion and enthusiasm that I've encountered from everybody in this industry. And I've spent a lot of time with a lot of people over the last few years as I've been talking workforce. And without a doubt, I have been so impressed with the level of passion and enthusiasm that I've encountered in the industry. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, I must agree. And that's one of the big reasons I started this podcast is if you think about it, the time is right. Beforehand, like after Mile Island and Chernobyl and Fukushima, people just got pretty quiet. You can't really say anything to your neighbors and friends about that when those bad things happen. But I think it's a bigger story. And the story you just mentioned and I talked about is the people are so passionate about the industry. And that's the folks. And I would say, to go back to the people question, people that don't really are not driven by that passion or know why they're showing up to work wash out because it is a tough, complicated world. I don't want them to wash out, but one of the supervisors I interviewed talked about, we let them know what it's like, the good stuff and the not so good stuff. Back to my question about getting the right people and making that sustainable. How do you talk to people, or what's your sense around that in terms of the future for our industry?
Yeah, I think more than ever before as an industry, we need to think about things differently. The way that the demographics are changing in the US and the worker expectations that are changing in the US, we need to be creative. We need to be prepared to be in an uber competitive work environment, particularly starting in the 2030s and moving forward, where we're just not going to have enough people to sustain all the jobs that we're going to have in the US, which means that we as an industry need to figure out how to make those jobs easier. I know they're tough, but culturally we need to figure that out because we're not going to be able to retain people over a period of time. Now, having said that, we started seeing before the pandemic an increase in our voluntary attrition in the industry, not due to retirement. During the pandemic, that leveled out because people were afraid to make any moves. Much like the rest of the US, immediately following the pandemic, we had huge voluntary attrition in our industry, much higher than what we've experienced before. And it threw the industry for a loop because we've never experienced that kind of turnover before. Now, luckily, things have leveled out at a higher level than pre-pandemic, but it's leveled out relatively speaking. Having said that, I don't think that we can expect that's going to continue to be the case. So in terms of retention, we need to be more creative about how we're managing our work environment, how we're managing culture, how we're dealing with work-life balance, how we're dealing with people commuting back and forth for 2 hours to get to our existing light water reactor plants. These are the things that we really need to think about as we're looking at competing. But more than that, I would say that as we not just look at getting people ready to go into our plants, but also getting ready for advanced reactors. We need to do some serious thinking about how we are training people and our approaches to that. Things are different than, for example, when I was growing up and learning, where you were in a classroom. That's just the way it was. You were in front of the little overhead projector with the little
Stage on the
transparent
stage.
slides
Yeah.
and all those kinds of things. And you sat there for days on end learning whatever materials you needed to learn. That's not the way people teach and learn these days. I know that IPPO has a teaching and learning initiative underway, and I think that's needed. I know EPRI's doing some great stuff in the areas of looking at how we teach and learn, and there's a lot of industry things going on. But we need to be more open to micro-credentials. We need to be more open to micro-blended learning. We need to be better about being creative in how we're choosing to train and qualify people. One thing that will never change in the nuclear energy industry is our standards. We will always have high standards, but there is a way that we can change how we're approaching jobs and how we're approaching educating people for those jobs to make it easier on both the companies and the individuals who are applying or attempting to get those skill sets. Stackable credentials. Those are going to become more of a thing.
Stackable credential.
Yeah, a stackable credential is one where you're slowly building a series of skills through credentials over time. As you go in, let's take a non-licensed operator as an example. You may have a certain set of skills that you have to have at a very basic minimum to get in to be an NLO. A stackable credential is one where, okay, they've learned this set of skills, so they have a credential for this. Now we're going to build on that, and we're going to give them this set of skills, and that's going to be another credential. And then we're going to build on this set of skills and give them this, and then this set of skills. One of the things that we're doing, both you and I are very familiar with the Nuclear Uniform Curriculum Program. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we're really doing is we're driving that towards stackable credentials. So what I mean by that is we're initiating, we hope, a 6-month basic credential that anybody can get to get into a job anywhere in energy, right? Then they can get in, and then they can use tuition assistance to go back to the community colleges and continue to build on their level of credentials. So they already have one, but then they can go and they can build and get to an NUCP associate's degree or another certificate, and then they can maybe even build and go to university level. That's when you talk about stacking credentials. It doesn't have to be that exact example, but it's taking a credential, a skill set, and slowly building on it so that people become proficient. And then you continue to build on that to the next level and next level. And in a way, it's a really good concept because one of the things that people are very clear about, especially younger workers, that is desirable to them is they want a constant growth path, career path. And if you can show them these set of stackable credentials and the pathways to get from point A to point F, they'll follow that pathway because that's so important to them. So it helps us in the teaching and learning environment, but it also helps us from an employee perspective because at that point, we're helping people continue to grow their skills so they can continue to grow their jobs and continue to grow their income and continue to grow their careers.
That's excellent. I want to take just a minute. Anthony Brown has been listening in on this conversation. Anything come to your mind, Anthony, that you wanted to ask Lori or me from that standpoint? I would love yours.
Yeah, like Lori mentioned, I'm still fairly new to the industry, so I'm still doing a lot of learning. One thing I will say is Lori definitely knows her stuff. So in most questions, I defer my best judgment to her.
Okay, fair enough. If something comes up, just interrupt. Don't be scared because I really want your perspective. A young person that's coming from the outside looking in, we want to make this a sustainable industry. We need people to really tell us what's going on. And one thing that Lori just brought up, the stackable credentials, makes so much sense because what I've heard is people want to know, they walk in the door and say, how do I become a supervisor in 5 years? And they ask these questions like, I would never think to do that just from what I started in this industry long ago.
I have a question for Anthony. Anthony recently supported some work that we were doing at the Conference on Nuclear Training and Education. And he had a chance to talk to a lot of people from the industry at our exhibition booth. So my question for Anthony was, What were your perceptions? What were your thoughts? What did you learn from all the people that you've had the opportunity to talk with from the industry, particularly these nuclear educators and these nuclear trainers? Anything stand out to you as being thematic or certain things that you heard?
I think first and foremost, I'd echo that there's no other group of people that are quite as passionate and dedicated to developing in the nuclear industry and finding ways to benefit the community. I think there's a large focus on developing these academic programs. I think I did hear a lot of interest in how are we getting from where we are right now to where we need to be? What does that road look like? I think most people are just really interested in like, how do we get there?
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
That is the question.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
what you're describing, Lori, is that ecosystem and building up those details so folks, the devil's in the details, as we all know. It's funny, I think about Donald Trump talking about tariffs and we're going to bring all this work back to the U.S. and factories. There are years of experience that these other countries have doing those things that's going to create a lot more chaos than we're anticipating. But I look at the same issue with nuclear plants.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we've been working on at NEI with the industry, this has been a collaborative industry effort, is developing that roadmap. And what I mean by that is we have a national industry strategic workforce plan that we put together. We did phase 1 and we published that in October of 2023. And it starts dealing with 3 of our industry segments: the current operating fleet, certain supplemental worker positions, and advanced reactors. And what it does is it delves into what are the challenges and obstacles we're looking at between now and 2050. What do we need to consider? What do we need to do? How do we need to get from here to there? And that document is that beginning piece of that conversation. So really what we're trying to do now is build on that document and do a lot of the implementation of solutions related to recommendations from that plan. And so that's a big part of how we're trying to get from A to Z in this mythical story that we're working on.
Yeah. What are the next phases and when do you see those coming out?
Yeah, phase 2, we've already started looking at things like international implications. And so we looked at questions like, let's say, for example, that our U.S. suppliers are successful in getting business abroad, because there's a lot of projected business abroad as much as there is potentially business in the U.S. What does that mean for them, their workforces, their growth, et cetera? But more interestingly, to me anyway, was the question of if there is huge expansion of advanced reactors abroad. Because in some cases, some people are a little ahead of us. I hate to say it, but from a national security standpoint, we need to be aware that we're not leading this issue right now. There's some others who are a little bit ahead of us. Anyway, as they're developing their new reactors, are they prepared with their regulatory infrastructure? They're prepared with their workforce? Are they prepared with their training, et cetera? What might be the implications for the U.S. workforce? For example, when Baraka went online, a lot of training and educators from certain groups got pulled to go over and help build that infrastructure. If we have mass buildings across the world, are we looking at a certain amount of brain drain in a period of time where we need everybody that we can get in the U.S. working on our own plants, right? So we started looking at that issue. Is there a potential for brain drain? And if so, where, under what circumstances, how big might it be, et cetera? Another thing that we're trying to figure out how to get our arms around, and I will be honest that we haven't figured it out yet, but we're working on it, is looking at supply chain. That's such a complex, difficult issue to talk about, particularly as you consider workforce. It's hard enough to get it to the current operating fleet and considering what we might be doing with advanced reactors. But when you get beyond those primary groups and think about all the supply chain issues supporting all of those things, and you look at the construction and manufacturing of those things, that's a whole nother apple that we need to be prepared to take the bite out of, right? And so we need to be prepared to address that. So we want to look at that. We also want to look at non-commercial nuclear. And the reason that we want to do that is it's really important that not just our commercial industry, but our non-commercial industry be supported, because these are things like the NRC, who approves all the licensing for our subsequent license renewal, for new advanced reactors, for new fuel types, et cetera. If they're not staffed up and fully qualified and able to take on that task when the time is needed, then we're going to be in trouble. If you look at DOE and you look at the test reactors and you look at various things that they have going on, if we don't have the researchers there, if we don't have what we need, and they're going through their retirement cliff now. In the commercial industry, we hit most of our retirement cliff already, but a lot of people in the nonprofit sector are now hitting their retirement cliff. So we're losing people. We need people in those positions as well. So when we look at the strategic workforce plan, we're not just looking at, oh, we care just about commercial nuclear. We care about making sure there's enough people to fully support the entire industry, or we're going to find ourselves in difficulty getting done everything that we need to get done as an industry. So those are examples of things that will happen in phase 2. Phase 3 will be things that will be more complicated to get our arms around. Things like advanced technologies. What's going to happen there? Things like fuel. Like we're figuring out fuel in the U.S. as we speak, given all the political ramifications of things that have been happening in the world. So there are other industry segments, as an example, in phase 3. When will these happen? We're working on phase 2. I'm not sure it will be completed before the end of this year, but I know that we would like to make significant progress on it this year while we're still doing a lot of the active implementation work from phase 1. Phase 3, I anticipate, will be 2 or 3 years from now.
Okay. And what's the total number of phases? Just 3 right now?
3 phases right now.
Yeah, I think about, I once helped a young engineer get a job. He was a friend of the son of a friend that I knew at church, and he was up in Canada, and I ended up getting a job in nuclear energy because I knew some folks up there. But one of the things that when I started talking to him is he didn't know what he didn't know. He didn't have a clue, didn't have experience, but super smart. And I knew he would be a good fit. But there was like a gap between him getting out of school and understanding what skills he had and how to connect that with whatever, all the needs we have in our industry. And he was successful finding a job. Last time I checked, he's still working in the industry. But I recognized that they let him loose. They give you a diploma and says, see you later, have a good life. And there wasn't a real good roadmap for him to even know what's available. He didn't know what he didn't know. How does your plan or your thoughts around his story make it easier for him to join our industry?
Yeah, there's a couple of really great things going on. And I want to start out with a pilot program that we started a few years ago, and we have grown since then. And it's really what we're calling a geo-targeting program. What that is, we started up at the University of Michigan, and we did a campaign. This campaign was to target 18 to 20-year-olds who were in and around the University of Michigan who were trying to figure out what they wanted to do with their lives. They got hit hard through social media and through texting with information about jobs in nuclear. We monitored 2 things. We sent them to a specific website, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And we also looked at enrollments in nuclear energy related and allied programs at the University of Michigan. Both those numbers went way up. So then we said, was that just a coincidence? Let's test that elsewhere. And we have now piloted at 3 different universities, and the numbers are staggering in terms of the hits that we're getting on our websites, the number of enrollments. I think at one of the universities, the number of enrollments went up by 78% by getting out and targeting people very specifically. One of the things that I've encouraged the industry to do, particularly as we looked at, there is a FOIA out there from the DOE related to a national safety credential
And
training.
what's a FOIA?
A FOIA is a request for funding. It's a way to get funding from the DOE for very specific things. And so the DOE puts out this document that says, we're offering funds for these types of things. If you're interested in these funds, you have to apply for them. And you have to show how you're going to meet this eligibility, this criteria, et cetera. And 2 of the things under that program is developing a national safety credential. The other is workforce development. And so a lot of consortia came together to respond to this because a primary responder has to be an academic institution. And a lot of the employers followed that. And one of the things that a lot of them wanted to do was partner with NEI. And I brought this geo-targeting program to them and said, you guys should consider funding these types of campaigns under the DOE FOIA if you get funding, because we've seen such great success. And I showed the statistics, I showed all of that, and they were all just blown away. Who isn't interested? And the amount of hits that we were getting on the website that we were sending to them far outpaced any other power generation source exponentially, because we were having success getting people going there. So that's an example of one thing. Another example is we created something called Nuclear Works, and we launched it in December of last year. And Nuclear Works is a new career and education pathway website. And what the intention is behind this, there are 6 target audiences for the website: high school students, graduates, technical vocational school students, graduates, community college students, graduates, university students, graduates, military veterans, and mid-career professionals. So those are the 6 target audiences. And the idea behind that is people can go into that website. This was created using the brain trust of the industry. So we all came together and said, what does this thing need to look like? What does it need to feel like? What does it need to convey? And some of the things that we thought were uber important were, number one, not a lot of text. This is more about people being able to go on, interface with a quiz, find out what they can do, learn about it. It has a lot of movement. It has a lot of cool colors. It has a lot of gamification, and it has a lot of resources. But it's not intended to be a descriptor of jobs in the industry. Although we have a card that comes up when they take the quiz on all these different types of things, and it describes at a high level what these jobs are. And so that's intended to be an entree into understanding jobs in nuclear energy, the wide depth and breadth of jobs that we have, because people don't understand. We've got everything from welders to electricians to chemistry technicians to different types of engineers to maintenance people. We have such a wide breadth and depth. And that's not even including things like the research institutions and the NRC and all of that. So there's so many great jobs. The other thing that we did in Nuclear Works is we created a map. And if people wanted to go and find jobs, they can go to the map, find employers near them, click on them, and go to their job boards as well. It's not intended to be a job board, Nuclear Works, but if somebody went there intending to find a job, they could also find a job there should they choose to do. But mostly it's about getting people to understand what their opportunities are, because most people in these communities don't understand the types of jobs that are at these plants. We've been so quiet for so long, and we're not out there talking up our jobs, that people just don't know, and they don't have experience and understanding. So this is a good entree. We're going to continue to build out this website with a bunch of different types of things, including I'm about to announce a new internship page where we're going to post internships on behalf of the industry. And we're going to continue to build things out. As an example, we have 2 highly specialized military recruiters from the industry, one from Southern, one from Dominion, who are working on building out our military career page to be more clear and specific about the pathways that people have using their skills getting into our industry. And we're going to continue that kind of thing with the rest of the website as well. So it's just the beginning. We've got lots of great plans for the website, lots of great things we're going to be doing. But those are examples of types of things that we're doing to really try to get people to understand better our jobs and get them aware of what they can do in our industry.
That's excellent. I want to tell you a story that I experienced, and I want your analysis of it. I work with a guy, Vic Thompson, who sadly passed away recently, but he had his nephew was graduating from NC State, and he said, hey, can you meet with my nephew? I'll take you to lunch. And I was like, whatever. I was just so overwhelmed because I had 75 people working for me. We had all these projects, like maybe 3 or 4 engineers assigned to this one huge project. And I had lunch with him, and I started talking to him, of course, asked him about his experience. He had absolutely no experience, never did an internship or anything. But I started talking to him about, tell me about a time you're proud of. And I worked on a project my senior year, and I worked on a team, but I recognized these folks weren't really doing their part. So I took it upon myself. I came up with this whole gearing thing, and he got excited about it. But how he came up with this gearing thing that he based it on X, Y, and Z. And I was like, So here's somebody with a excited attitude. And that engineers, if you ever dealt with them, they're tinkerers. They love tinkering with things, solving problems, all those things. So I saw the makings of something. And then I went back to my office, and I appreciated getting a free lunch, but I went back to my office and I looked at the type of work our engineers were doing. So I was able to bring him as a contractor, and I applied him to the equipment database. So every project has, you might guess, hundreds of pieces of equipment, transmitters, valves, actuators, and you have hundreds of those on a spreadsheet, and then you give them to someone and he or she incorporates those into our database, but you have to check to make sure they're the right engineering whatevers, and it takes forever, and engineers don't like it. So I brought the guy in. He started working on that within, I would say, days. It was crazy. He took this long list and he showed it to me, the spreadsheet. He had different colors. We were deleting this one. We're modifying this one. We're creating this one. And I got calls from the equipment database guy at the plant that said, "Thank you, Bill. Otherwise, I would have had to deal with this." He was given the ability to add and change records and all that because he was trusted by this guy. Took so much workload off of him. The engineers loved it. And guess what? He was telling me stories about, this engineer hasn't given me what I need for this. That's funny. Maybe he's pretty overworked. So I'd almost say he was a mole, but regardless of that part, it was I created a job that worked well with him, helped the organization, helped with the quality. I could see where he was, but it was such a unexpected thing because this just fell in my lap. How can we apply a similar kind of thought process to what you're describing? Are you tired of using paper procedures in the field? They should not be used at all in 2025. And there's a much better alternative. My friends at Next Axiom have it. It's electronic procedures that's integrated with your system so you never get the wrong version. When you type something in that's out of spec, it identifies it. So you don't have to worry about whether you're in spec. It'll tell you. Also, it has automatic branching. And it's not as hard to implement as you might think. Don't get lost in paper procedures. Go to nextaxiom.com and contact my friends there to get your demonstration.
Yeah, one of the things that I have been touting across the industry is, particularly as we get into this more competitive era where we're going to need to really be drawing as many people as we can and getting them proficiently skilled and qualified, is we need to stop. One of the things we looked at in the strategic plan is what we call training qualifications. And one of the things that we need to stop doing is requiring that everybody fit our pigeonholed understanding of what a job has historically been. We need to be more creative about understanding the skills that people come in with, applying whatever standards, ANSI standards, whatever the case may be, and then figuring out how we can remanage jobs. Going back to that stackable credential, going back to micro credentials, going back to all of that, there's a way where we can switch how we think about jobs. And we can also think about how to look at how we're recruiting people, which is if they don't fit the standard, they're not qualified and they can't
filter them out.
We need to figure out how to get people who have a good quality skill set and get them to be workable. Rather, it's doing what you talked about, which is how can we rejigger these jobs to be successfully applied to the skill sets of the people that we have coming in. And we need to be more creative. That's just the way I think it's going to have to be as we move forward in the next decade. So we need to stop being rigid in our approach and thinking. We need to ensure always that we're getting people to be proficient in the job that we're stating that they're doing, because there are implications related to NRC oversight, ACAD, so forth, so on. But if we take a part of that job and we isolate the skills needed, we can absolutely get somebody credentialed for that job, and then we can build on it. So we need to be more creative in how we're approaching these jobs moving forward.
So fast forward 9 months later, and I met with him every week. And I said, "What do you want to do next?" He goes, "I'm pretty happy doing what I'm doing." I was like, "Listen, you didn't go to 4 years of college to do spreadsheets. Let's put you in a position where you can do some engineering work." And I almost had to pull him out of his comfort zone just a little bit to put him in a much better career path. Here's the crazy part, and I'll share this with you. So I brought him in at a cheap rate as a contractor. So I had many contractors working for me. Here's the crazy part. I tried to get him to come in house. And at that point, headcount was a huge thing. We can't hire him. And like, he's building a family. He's looking to buy a house at the time. I couldn't convince the organization to hire him, which was crazy to me. And here's the second part I tried to do is get him a big raise because he was no longer doing equipment database stuff. He's now doing engineering work. And they were like, no, we max out all contractors, blah, blah, blah. And
Yeah.
they almost hamstrung me. But it goes back to, we have to look at the world more holistically, longer term. And it was hard. And I know we had, at the time, we had money constraints. But what do you have to say to an organization, like you said, that has many structures in place to prevent people from being creative? How do you get out of that mode?
Yeah, you have to listen to what people are saying. It's not like there's not the evidence out there of what people are saying that they want and need out of jobs and cultures of where they're working. For example, we participated in an NEY workshop a few years ago where we asked them all about retention. What does it take to retain you in our industry? And they were very clear about what it is that they're looking for, what it is they want. And we shared that information with the chief nuclear officers, et cetera. The mystery, there's no mystery. We just need to listen and we need to adapt accordingly. And that's going to become more and more important over time. I wish I could say it was some big major programmatic thing, but in the end, it's really about listening and adapting and being flexible in your approach. And I would say that as an industry, in some cases, we're doing that extraordinarily well. In other cases, we're probably doing that less well. So we just need to continue to push ourselves as an industry to be a little bit more broad in our thinking and our approach, particularly as we gear up and look at workforce issues over the next decade.
Yeah, what were some of the things you heard that maybe are not as easy to implement?
Yeah. So one of the things they were very clear about is that for them, they want to go work at places that feel innovative, modern, and updated. And what I mean by that is, yes, there's a physical facility part of that, but there's also a cultural piece of that. They want to know that they're working for groups that are being progressive and innovative and trying to push the needle and doing interesting and new things. They don't want to be stuck in the same day-to-day rut. Having said that, it does our industry a big service by not having digital INC in place. So you have these people who spend their entire lives dealing with digital, and then they go into a 1950s analog room. Now, I understand the challenges associated with updating from analog to digital. I think that we need to track that and that we really need to think about the unseen cost of not upgrading to digital INC as we can as an industry. There are these unseen costs associated with it. We know the real costs associated with it, but there's these cons associated with it. So that's an example of something. They want someplace that feels modern and innovative to work in. Another thing that they care about, and we talked about this to some degree, but I want to highlight it again. There were a couple of people who talked about during their experience that when they got in, it took them years to find out about the programs that the company could offer to help them grow their careers. And that broke my heart because there should be no reason while doing the offboarding process that we're not doing something as simple as explaining all of the career pathways in the programs and providing a leaflet, a brochure, something electronically, whatever the case may be, that explains all the different career growth options that they might have working there. How easy is that to implement? But over and over, we were hearing from the group, they didn't find out until 5 years after they'd been there that there was like a leadership program. And I was just like, how do we not make sure that these people are aware of these things? And because of that, it put them at risk. By that point, they were so disenfranchised about feeling like they were being stuck in a place that they didn't really care when they found out that there was a leadership program because they were already disenfranchised, because nobody was telling them about the opportunities that were present for them. So for me, that was shockingly bad on our part as an industry. I honestly couldn't believe it when I heard it. The other thing that I think is more surprising is they basically said this, and this is about on-site work. There's a lot of discussion out there these days about everything needs to be remote. If you can't be remote, you're not going to be able to get workers out. What they said in this conversation was, look, we understand that there are needs to go on site. But if you want us to spend 2 hours or an hour and a half driving back and forth every day, then what we're going to ask is that you help us with the things that we're not able to do in our lives because we're spending that time commuting for 3 to 4 hours a day. Some lifestyle things that you can bring on. They were looking at things like childcare subsidies and things like that. And initially, some of them had said, oh, maybe we should just have daycares on site. We're just don't know about daycare inside the emergency zone. Daycare subsidies or daycare right outside the emergency zone or whatever, those are possibilities. But just things like getting their car washed on site or all the things that they do with that extra time where they're not commuting back and forth. They want those types of lifestyle benefits They also want work-life balance to a degree. That probably is a little bit less familiar to those of us who are a bit older, who didn't grow up with the same level of expectation regarding work-life balance. So those were examples of some of the things that they said.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Anthony, I can't help but think about you. Is any of the stuff that you heard really you want to comment on?
Yeah, I think definitely the work-life balance and lifestyle expectations are big priorities, especially for my generation. And especially for someone who's grown up in a hybrid environment, and we're so used to and more comfortable with having that extra free time. And it seems backwards almost to want to be on site every day, especially in one that isn't as technologically advanced. I think technology is a big draw for people like me. The modern, innovative, as Laura mentioned. I love coming into the office personally. I think it's a beautiful office and I like being around the people, but I think there are certain incentives to that you add, like those lifestyle expectations.
No, I completely agree. Laura, did you want to say something?
I think Anthony's reflecting back what we heard. Again, no surprises. This stuff has been published. This stuff has been known. This stuff is not new. It's how we're dealing with it as an industry. And that's the piece that we have to keep our eye on. Yeah. There are certain things that we can do as an industry to drive our strategic plan forward, but these are things that are not cultural-based. The cultural-based issues, the things that these companies have to decide on their own individually, that's the tough part because I don't have control over what they're choosing to do from a policies and procedures and processes perspective. So the best I can do is continue to provide the information and say, this is what the expectations are. This is what people are looking for. This is the most up-to-date information, and then hope that industry embraces that information and adapts to the degree that they can accordingly.
You think about operating experience. Why not make it positive operating experience? Here's a plant in the middle of a rural area, I'll say, that has been able to get and retain people. I think about, you mentioned NEYGN. I went to a station that had a really active NEYGN group. And I won't say it was sorority-like or fraternity-like, but there were a group of people, they did Habitat for Humanity. They marched in parades, they created a float. Mm-hmm. And this was in a very rural part of Louisiana. Do you think those are possibilities?
Absolutely. I think what each company needs to be aware of is how it needs to adapt to the different groups that it has in its population. What I don't want to do is forget that, yes, we have the greatest amount of voluntary attrition that we have is in our people with 0 to 5 years of experience and 5 to 10 years of service. That tends to be our younger population. But what I don't want to do is forget that we have other populations as well in our workforce. And so what that tells me is that we need to be flexible in how we're approaching our overall packages and our overall culture. Certain things are more important to certain groups of people and other things are more important to other groups of people. How do we design our benefits packages? How do we design our work processes and procedures to allow for the flexibility needed for the different prioritization that different groups have for different things? And also culturally, there is always a drive for people to feel like they're part of a community. So when you were saying about the floats and things like that, there's always activities like that people want to be a part of because they want to be part of the community, because they feel a sense of attachment. They're at work for so many hours a day, right? You want to feel attached to the people beside you. You want to feel attached to the company and the organization itself. And so culturally, I think you always have to be able to offer those things. But more than that, you need to take a holistic approach to how you're designing your compensation, your benefits, your rewards, your culture, because you need to be able to reward people in different ways based on what's important to them and how they prioritize things. For some people, perhaps they're starting families, having time off might be the priority for them at that point in their life. But for somebody else, it might be having really super duper medical benefits. How do you design that fulsome approach to looking at these things so that you can be as attractive as possible to as many different groups as possible?
Yeah, that's a great thing. And it got me thinking, because when I drive around, I think of these scenarios, but the one that came to mind recently was, I think about the Palisades fire. And it was front page news. You were seeing the homes, lives destroyed, They were interviewing people, helicopters, C-130s or whatever, flying over, all those emotional stories. It was a huge deal. And then what you're describing is, what if we prevented the fires? What if we ran water pipes to the areas that are most vulnerable, change how they catch on fire? The material gets swept up and taken out so it doesn't sustain a fire or respond quickly so the fire starts, but it gets put out right away. But what I can tell you, being in the industry as long as I have been, the Palisades fire is what we were good at: responding, reacting, putting resources in a moment's notice, and getting people to show up to talk about longer term sustainable things. It was the bane of my existence. I really struggled to get people to show up to meetings if something was 6 months out. So how do you infuse that kind of long term? And I'm sure you're laughing that this has occurred to you before.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, it comes down to, we have to continue to make the business case and keep it in front of those who need to be aware of these issues. I think occasionally we get so caught up in the day-to-day things that are happening, this regulatory issue, this thing dealing with that we don't keep these pending big issues in front of people. And so one of my jobs is that I periodically report out to the chief nuclear officers. We talk about these things at the Workforce Working Group. I talk across the industry at various conferences and things. Part of my job is to keep these things visible, because people need to understand the implications if they're not talking about things, if they're not trying to address certain things. And some are not in a place where they're ready to deal with that right now. But by keeping it in front of them over time, they might get to that point where they're ready. In other cases, they're like, yeah, we've been thinking about these things and we're trying to do this and we're doing this. It's really, you can't force change. What you can do is provide the business cases to why change may be needed and what that level of change might need to be and how that level of change might be able to occur. And so that's my job. Can't force anybody to do it. I can only put the business case in front of them as to why it's important.
Yeah. And you don't want to end up being a cheerleader. You want to really get them to see the benefits. So can you talk a little bit about the numbers? What kind of turnover are we seeing? What kind of growth in the industry are we anticipating?
Yeah. I'll start with advanced reactors. DOE liftoff report said that between manufacturing, construction, and operation and management, that between now and 2050, we're looking at about adding 376,000 people to our industry. That's essentially doubling the size of our existing industry. That's a huge task. Now, having said that, I will say those numbers, along with the numbers that NEI provided in its strategic workforce plan, are highly speculative because you have to make a certain set of assumptions at this point that can go very different over the reality of time. But nonetheless, what I keep trying to tell people is, don't focus on the number itself. Focus on the volume. Focus on the scope, because that's the piece that's important. Whether it's going to be 376,000 or 276,000 or even 150,000, regardless, for our industry, that's huge. And we need to keep our eye on the bigger picture of, let's not squabble about the details. Let's keep our eye on the big picture that we're growing as an industry. The demand is there. Yes, we have some challenges and obstacles we need to overcome to get to the point where that demand is being able to be satisfied, but we're working as an industry on that. So let's be prepared. Let's not wait for things to shake out when it's too late. When you're looking at workforce development, you cannot do it last minute. Developing workforce requires years of putting the right things in the right places, the right programs, the right different sets of resources, assets, etc. This is not something you can do in 10 minutes before a plant goes online, right? So this is something bigger than that. So we need to focus on that. So number one, from advanced reactor perspective, we're just looking at potentially huge numbers between now and 2050. That's already challenging enough to consider. But then when you also consider the current operating fleet and the voluntary attrition that we're seeing. Now, I want to be very clear that our industry is not as bad as like the high turnover industries like retail and restaurants and things like that. But for our industry, we have seen much higher turnover than what we've seen in the past. Like I said earlier, it's leveled out, but we're at a much higher level. And we can only anticipate that's going to continue to grow as we have to compete more and more for fewer workers in the U.S., particularly starting in the 2030s. And as I said, the places where we're seeing the most turnover are those with 0 to 5 years of service and 5 to 10 years of service. And typically those tend to be, not all in all cases, sometimes you get mid-career professionals coming in. So I want to be very clear that this isn't the case for everybody, but this tends to be your younger workers. And that aligns with a lot of the national trends that you see, where basically younger workers are saying, we want to go somewhere and stay somewhere for our careers. But you know what? There's a couple things we have to think about. Number one, if the money's better somewhere else, I have to consider chasing it because guess what? I have a ton of student debt I have to pay off. What people don't realize is how impactful student debt is to people's decisions. Or they're entering a new phase of life where they're starting families and things and they need that work-life balance or they need this or whatever the case may be. So there is a challenge that we have. Now, the other piece is because this is where we're experiencing our turnover in these lesser serviced years, that means that we're a little bit on a hamster wheel, right? In terms of we're getting people in, we're spending all that time, energy, effort to train them because we know how expensive it is to train in nuclear energy. But then these are the people that we're leaving. We're not leaving them after 20 years where we've gotten a good use of those funds, right? We're losing them less than 5 years or less than 10 years. So we're getting much less return on our investment when you're losing people earlier in their service careers. So that means that we need to be better about figuring out how to get people trained and qualified more quickly, more easily. Either that, or we have to also deal with the cultural benefits, compensation issues that are causing people to turn over in the first place. So it's probably some combination of those two that need to be dealt with, but nonetheless, we need to be cognizant of those things as we look at those numbers, particularly related to voluntary attrition.
Yeah, you mentioned, I'll give you a couple examples that I've heard from, the tree pollen starting to get up there.
I noticed.
I talked to a lot of nuclear leaders. One of the things that was surprising to me is shift managers that I spoke with. They were working a lot of overtime. So ops in general was working a lot of overtime. When you delve a little bit deeper, they talked about people were going to data centers, which we all know is very popular now. But I think about it long term, who would want to work in a data center? And what they were doing, monitoring temperature, HVAC, output, things like that. I'm like, that's got to be the most boring job. But if you think about it from context, they were working so much overtime, they missed their kids' soccer games and things like that. And they were willing to lose that kind of upward momentum for a few years just so they can have a life that's evened out. And what you're describing is some of that. Thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, agreed. People are leaving for a variety of reasons. Some cases it's work-life balances, some cases it's policies and practices or cultural issues. For example, as we look at women in our industry, while we are having much more success recruiting people into our industry, we're not retaining them. So we're seeing very minimal increases in the number of women. So we need to look at policies and things that affect women, right? And that might be things related to maternity leave or things like that. You have to look at this individually based on each company. So there's that. But there's other circumstances, like I mentioned, student debt. I don't want to underestimate the impact that student debt has because people are making decisions where they're putting aside their personal desires and growth to chase the money because they just don't see, they can't afford to buy that new house. They can't afford to have that family. They can't afford to do those things unless they get some of that student debt paid off. And so for them, it's not really a decision. If they're offered more money somewhere, they're going to go because to them, it's like, how do I not chase that money because I need to get to a better place in my life? I want to afford to be able to buy a house. Like, I don't think people understand how taxing it is on the younger generations who feel like that they don't have the possibility of being able to buy a house. And that's something we need to keep in mind. I can't blame them. If I was in a similar circumstance, might I chase the money too, even if I'm less satisfied with my job, because I just feel like I'm stuck and I can't do those things I want to in life because I just don't have the wherewithal to do what I want to do. So you certainly can't judge their decisions, but we as an industry need to take a look at those kinds of things and consider what we can do to mediate. Some companies are offering additional money to help out with student loans. There are a variety of different types of things that we can do to help people with those things that are considered to be issues for them, but we just need to be open and flexible to those potential approaches. They may care more about having that student loan paid off right now than their 401k match. I hate to say it, when we went in pensions, 401k, like we really cared about that kind of stuff. Now I see a lot of younger people deferring out of 401ks because they're still like, that can't be my priority right now. I got 30, 40 years to worry about retiring. Right now, I got to worry about the student debt. I got to worry about this. I got to worry about this. I got to worry about this. I can't even afford it. There's this whole thing of giving up free money because that's how they feel in terms of their financial situation. And so that's the choices that they're feeling like they're having to make.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to bring you back. You talked about the old technology and digitizing our industry. I know it's probably not your focus, but for example, I've worked with Duke Energy and I spent over $100 million upgrading their reactor protection system to an Ariva system that was already operating in Europe for years. And they thought it was a slam dunk, but it took 10 years and over $100 million to get that license. As a result, a lot of companies, we don't want to have to go through that. And I know that part of that is like the Vocal 3 and 4. This is the first time in many years we did that.
Right.
So I understand that. But how are you interacting with the hearts and minds of the people at the NRC that are tasked with keeping our nuclear industry safe, but understand the balance between the effects that you described and us not evolving?
Yeah. We have an entire group of people at NEI whose sole job is to interface with the NRC and to try to work with them on looking at issues based on probabilistic risk assessment. For those who don't know what that is, the shorthand is what we call PRA, but it's basically saying, what risk is there really compared to the cost that you're looking to incur? And so we're really trying to introduce more PRA into the conversation. Because why ask a company to spend tens of millions of dollars on something that has a minimal impact on the safety and the running of the operations of a plant? Yep. We have an entire group that kind of has those conversations with the NRC whenever we see that this thing is coming up or this thing's coming up or they're looking at this or whatever. So we have an entire group of technical experts who are constantly looking at that kind of thing. Related to digital INCs specifically, we also have couple groups, industry-wide group and an NEI group that are really trying to drive inroads into helping with the digital INC conversation and helping people get there. Having said that, you're absolutely right. First of a kind issues are brutal, meaning that's one of our biggest deterrents to the advanced reactors because people are unsure about money and cost. When you're first of a kind, you're taking on all that risk and you don't know what it could end up in terms of cost, right? Once you get to fourth, fifth of a kind, people feel comfortable. They're like, okay, now I feel like I can invest. So what do we do to try to help set up protections? And that's one of the things that NEI is trying to promote right now is how can we get some kind of insurance in place? And who can provide this insurance for cost overruns related to first of a kind issues? Whether it's a new fuel, or whether it's a new type of reactor, or any of these majorly expensive things that we need in order to drive the industry forward, how can we develop something that helps us insure against some of these cost overruns for the first however many of these until we get into the balance running them? For example, you know that we built most of our plants in the U.S. within a period of time, right? Of course, the first ones were going to be hugely expensive, but as we got better, more efficient at it, the cost of doing these things, economies of scale, the marginal cost, etc., got better. And so that's what we need to consider as we look at these big capital projects in the industry is first of a kind is brutal. What can we do to help facilitate those? And what can we do as an industry to drive forward the thinking that these things are necessary and that they do require a certain amount of risk, but what can we do to be proactive to help offset some of that risk so that we can make it less scary for people?
Yeah, and I think about it from an inspector standpoint. It's not so much getting it through quickly. It's the one thing that doesn't go well. And your boss says, how did you let this get through? It's the needle in the haystack type thing. There's no upside to go quicker in his or her mind.
Yeah.
How do you get through that given our maturity of our industry? I'm putting you on the spot on that one. I know it's not
and I'm not sure I have the best answer, but what I will say is, again, it comes to having those open conversations with the NRC, say, but was the safety significant? It may have gotten through, but what is the safety significance of it? If it's a minimal safety significance, okay, let's call it lessons learned. Let's put something in place. Let's do what we need to do through our corrective procedures and let's move on. If it is a major safety issue, that's a whole different thing. Luckily, what I would say is in our industry, very rarely does something safety significant occur or get through because we are so predetermined to be precise and specific because we understand as much as anybody else in the world that an incident for nuclear in any place is an incident for nuclear everywhere. So we're really cognizant of it as an industry. Number one, we want to operate safely. That's just how we are, right? But number two, we understand the implications of letting these things get through and whatever. So we do as much as we can to safeguard against all of those things. But specifically when you're related to NRC, you need to help them keep it in focus, which is what is the level of safety significance associated with this? You're never going to have a perfectly performing plant, but do you have a perfectly safe plant or a mostly safe plant or a 99.9% safe plant? That's what you're trying to achieve. Perfection is something that's just not going to exist. So having those conversations with the NRC and bringing that back to a realistic understanding of safety significance, I think is important.
I agree. I get you. But I think about what Elon Musk was able to do outside of NASA with SpaceX because he was quickly failing and doing things and adapting. Now, the results of that wouldn't have been like we would have in the nuclear industry, but it's just an interesting concept and how could we apply something similar. But I don't think we're there yet. But
yeah, I think because of the level of safety culture and safety importance that we place on these things in the U.S., I think that we're never going to be that loosey-goosey in terms of how we approach our innovation and developing operations. But nonetheless, the great thing is that with simulators these days, with the technologies that we have, with the types of analysis that we have, we can do so much to offset the sense of risk that in the past would have been much more difficult to do, that we should be able to speed up the process. And in many cases, as we're looking at our advanced reactors, their risk profile is not the same. They don't have the same kinds of things happening with them where there is a risk of meltdown or et cetera. So given that it's a different risk profile, does it need to go through the same regulatory basis? That's a question. Some are saying, can we treat some of these like test reactors because their risk profiles are much more in line with that? So that's a question. And so those are all things that we're looking at and we're having discussions with the NRC about.
Yeah, I'll get off this topic here in a second. I remember having discussions or listening to NRC talk about, for example, digital common mode failure. And you could talk for hours about the possibility of that happening and how it hasn't happened, but you can never prove it won't happen. And it was it went on for years. And I know it's a possibility, but maybe now with technology, we can get over the hump and really show what's possible, like you described.
Well, one thing I will say, getting away from the technical side of things and back into the workforce piece of it, we actually have the NRC and DOE on our workforce working group. So they're part of these conversations and they know what we're looking at. And we also have some insights as to what they're looking at from their workforce issues, which is really helpful because it gives us a greater, more holistic approach as an industry. And it helps with a level of cooperation in terms of having these discussions about workforce that I think is really helpful.
Yeah, no, it can't hurt. And building trust with other folks is such an important thing. And I heard back before I came into the industry how those discussions happen with NRC. And I'll give you a quick story of how it happened for me. So we were doing a bunch of projects. We had this one project where we were cutting up our old steam generators and shipping those off-site and storing those on rail cars and getting ready to ship those. And I saw the NRC resident in the admin building. And he said, "Hey, Bill." And I said, "Hey, Joe, how are you?" And he said, "Hey, let me ask you a question," which is always a great lead in. But he said, "Is it okay to park rail cars in the standby nuclear service water dam?" And I was like, "Joe, I don't know. Let me go check." So I ran back to my office, found out, no, they were not designed to have surcharge load is what it's called on the dam, but it assumed that the seismic event that the dam was designed for did not occur with that happening since didn't happen too often. So Of course, we had to pull the rail cars off the dam and all that good stuff. But I understood where he was coming from. He understood where I was coming from. He quickly came to consensus. And I can say without any qualms that I trusted his ability to do his job. And I think he trusted me to do my job.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the reasons why, from an NRC perspective, it's important that not only they have full staffing, but they have full staffing that is qualified and proficient. Yes. Because if you have a bunch of younger workers going in there who don't really understand the operational issues and haven't had a lot of access to those types of issues, it's going to slow down a lot of our processes. People don't think about that. Not only do we need good people at the NRC, we need them to be fully proficient and understand truly the operational issues that we're dealing with and the implications of those issues.
Yeah, that's a great point. And anybody can ask a question. Answering those questions aren't as easy, but I want to look to wrap things up. I appreciate an hour and a half with you, Lori Brady. But let me ask you a question about your own approach. So you're coming into a job in a complicated 6 units running and all the work that's going on. What keeps you coming back to your job? What are you proud of, and what keeps you coming back and continue with the amount of energy that you obviously bring to the job?
Yeah, I love my job, and I love being part of this. I don't want to call it a nuclear renaissance because I think renaissance at this point has negative connotations given historically what's happened. But where we're going with the future of nuclear energy is just so compelling, and it's interesting, and it's just something that can really help and benefit the United States and how we approach energy and the energy portfolio in the U.S. I really feel like workforce is a big piece of that. And if we don't have the workforce needed, we're not going to be able to do all the great things that we want. Now, I'm not saying that workforce is the only thing that's needed in order to make our fleet be successful over the long term, but it's a big piece. And every day when I get to work, I'm just like, I'm helping to build the future of the industry. How much more interesting of a job and how much more of a challenging job can you have than knowing that your day-to-day stuff that you're doing can help positively impact the future of an entire country, right? I'm doing my small part, but hopefully my small part helps to build something bigger that really helps us overall as a country and a nation related to our overall energy portfolio. How exciting is that? To me, it's a challenge. To me, it's an adventure. And how much more exciting can that get?
And I really want to thank you for what you do, Lori. It's been exciting to talk to you. And I want to give Anthony a chance to wrap things up. Anything from your end, Anthony, that you heard that you wanted to comment on, or thoughts about the industry overall?
I think I look at this as just a really good opportunity to learn, because there's so much information out there. So I'm still really focused on taking it in. So I really appreciate you both letting me lurk in the background and listen and take my notes and find my place in all of this and see all of the benefits and things that I've yet to have in my ear. So thank you again.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Anthony. What are 1 or 2 takeaways that you have from today? Top of mind takeaways.
Yeah. So top of mind, I think, are just like you said, for developing the workforce. We know what people are looking for. We just have to listen and implement. I think is really interesting that there is so much information out there. Just acting upon it maybe sometimes is a little more difficult. And yeah, I think that's really the top of mind one, is that the information is there. We just have to use it.
Thank you, Anthony. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Lori. I'm going to let you folks go. I know you probably have a whole list of things you want to get done for the rest of the day.
We appreciate it. It's been great talking with you. And that hour and a half flew by, didn't it?
Yeah. And how can folks get a hold of you and NEI and some of those websites you mentioned? I'll put those in the show notes, but what are they off the top of your head?
Absolutely. So the new website is nuclearworks.org, all one word. So you can go there to contact NEI. On the Nuclear Works page, there's a Nuclear Works email address that you're more than happy to contact. But you can also contact our main number at 202-739-8000 and ask to be forwarded to Anthony, myself, or any member of my team. And we're happy to answer whatever questions that we can, or whoever may have questions out there.
Great. And thanks again. We're going to end right on time for once, so that's great. All right.
All right,
Take care.
Take care.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a nice day. Bye.